For those who don't know me, I'm Lindy Crew, CAARI's director. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Pamela Gaber, Professor Emerita of Archaeology, Art History and Judaic Studies at Longue College in Pennsylvania. Professor Gaber is well known to many of our audience and has been working on Cyprus for a long time, devoting her career to the site of Idalion. She first arrived in 1972 as a graduate student as part of the joint American expedition to Idalion. For 3 years, from 1976, she was in charge of the University of Connecticut Field School at the site. Pam was awarded her doctorate in ancient art and archaeology at Harvard in 1982, and in 1987 received a permit to run her own excavations at Idalion when she was teaching at the University of New Hampshire. In 1992, the dig affiliated with the University of Arizona, and from 2003, the Idalion expedition began to be supported by Longue College. And her work finalizing the excavation and publication of the site continues, and we will hear more about that this evening. Pam has authored numerous articles on archaeology and identity, on the iconography of ancient goddess worship, on landscape archaeology, and has written a book on Cypriot sculpture. She has published excavation reports on Idalion, and the volume on the excavations of the Adonis Temenos on the East Acropolis is due out in 2026, as is a volume recently submitted to ASOR as part of the CAARI monograph series, which she has co-edited with Dr. Evi Margaritis. This is the output from a 2017 CAARI conference on the influence of the environment on archaeological sites in Cyprus, and we look forward very much to seeing that volume out too. So I would now like to invite Pam to present her lecture entitled La Longue Durée, The View from Idalion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy, and thank you all for being here, for joining us. Those of you who saw the abstract of this lecture will not be surprised, but the rest of you might be a little surprised because La Longue Durée in this context is a double entendre. It's not just talking about the 4,000 plus years that Idalion has continued to exist without interruption. It's also about my 53 years working here. Is it? It's fine.
Sorry, go on, I can't see it.
Okay. Anyway, yes, 53 years, as Lindy said. And there's still work to do, as you'll see. So rather than presenting we found this and we found this and then this happened, which many of you have seen over the years. Can't see because of the lighting. Anyway, what I really am going to talk about is the fact that working on the same site, this huge city site, for all this time, many things have come up that led to other avenues to explore. It's not invented. That's all right. I can just do this. It's okay. No, it's not. It was before. It just mouthful. All right. I just want you to know it was working fine 15 minutes ago. Thanks. I don't know if this is going to work. But there are what I think of as side roads that I've gone down that have been, introduced by what we found. A number of them, urbanization, as you can see, goddess iconography, as Lindy mentioned, the Hellenistic Roman transition in the hinterland, because a lot of attention has been paid over the decades on the coast and very little on the hinterland. But there are things that happen here at Idalion that say a lot about Cyprus in general. And really, the sanctuary in the lower city south was not seen by Bonifaz Richter, wasn't seen by the Swedes, it wasn't seen by anyone else until we stumbled on it accidentally. And it is the city sanctuary, the sanctuary to the great goddess and her acolytes. Now, most of you in the audience know this stuff about the mentions in the Assyrian annals through the decades and the centuries of Cyprus and the copper from the various sites on Cyprus. A lot of people don't pay attention to the fact that Idalion is the first in all of these lists, all the way through. And even earlier than the Assyrian lists, of course, we have the Medinet Habu inscription from 1175-ish. And it does mention Ithal, which is probably Idalion. And it may be referring at that early date to Iosizomenos, as we'll see. But I discovered this past year and going through all of the ancient mentions I could find that really, well, I'll let Yorgos Papasavvas tell you himself. In the 18th century, Shamshi Adad plundered the tomb of Yahdun Lim of Mari because he wanted to get the 500 kilograms of Cypriot bronze that he knew to be in that tomb. So really, they're trading by the 18th century, certainly, in vast quantities. In Mesopotamia from 2000 to 1745, copper comes from both Al-Ashia, Cyprus, of course, and Magan and Dilmun. Magan is Oman, Dilmun is Bahrain. And it's important to note that from 2000 BCE onward, Al-Ashia is mentioned increasingly, more and more, becomes more and more important. And by 1745, it is alone. No one else is providing copper to the Mesopotamian powers that were. So if they're shipping huge quantities of copper by the early to second millennium BCE, they can't be agrarian. I mean, it's not the farmers who are producing the copper and shipping it. So when did urbanism begin? Well, this, as you know, has been a vexed topic for a long time. And of course, originally, or shall we say for the last 3 or 4 decades, it has been common to say that until the late Bronze Age, Cyprus was agrarian and rural and a very nice egalitarian place to live, if you like. Falconer and Fall in 2014, the relatively late urbanization on the island around 1450 BC. Rupp, by the way, says the same thing. And more recently, I think, for me, somewhat startlingly, there's abundant evidence for Middle Bronze Age agrarian economy, and that's Papandreou and Dionis, okay, in Land, the special issue 2019. But what caught my eye in this special issue was Jennifer Webb's reprint of her 2018. In that same issue, she talks about shifting centers, site location and resource procurement in the north. What was it she said that was so important? Excuse me. Vasilia Vunus and Lapitos All three appear to have been large settlements with significant political, economic, and ideological authority at both the local and interregional level. Not farmers. She amasses a huge amount of data to support this. She gives you charts, and those of you who were at the KIT conference heard a much expanded version of this. And that publication, I am told, is coming out next year. But we'll just give you a breakdown here. The copper that is produced at these three sites at this early date is mind-blowing. So what does she conclude? She says, there has long been a tendency in Cypriot archaeology to romanticize the early Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age as comprised of peaceful, agrarian, egalitarian settlements, etc., as we've been saying. She sums up her analysis of all of this material, and she says that this material suggests a very different scenario, a complex mix, etc., basically a network of economic transactions linking functionally specialized settlements over considerable distances. Well, if you take this together with the fact that she also notes large settlement agglomeration during this period, it looks to me like we're talking about the birth of urbanism. And I have proceeded along those lines, as you'll see. The chronological framework, anybody who works in this area knows very well that it is a topic that everyone has ideas about. So I've been following Webb mostly, the 2018 dates that she gives. So she has the early Cypriot 1 to 3 from 2250 basically to 1950. I'm looking mostly at the Middle Cypriot. I think that's what I'm talking about in my stuff. I've been following Kevin Fisher's late Bronze Age chronology, and he also gives a nod to the so-called alternative periodization, which you can see here. Knapp in 2023 came out with this interesting formulation of his dates. The most important one from my point of view, which startled me, was his early Iron Age, late Cypriot 3B, 1125 to 1050. Because that is a very important set of dates for Idalion. Now, to be honest, I tend to avoid period labels, and I just go for the century. I think that you can call it whatever you want if you know what the date is. So what is the view from Idalion in this case? Well, according to the things we've just seen, in the Adonis Temenos, the terrace of the East Acropolis, is this where? Yes, it is. Excellent. The founding levels are on bedrock. And the floor buildup on which this altar and offering table are placed is what we've just seen called LC3 proto-geometric. It's 12th century. It's also important to note that on the opposite Acropolis, of course, Idalion has an east and a west. On the West Acropolis, Maria Hadjikosti, actually it was Yorgos Georgiou, for those of you who are interested, who actually did the excavation under her direction, of a pithos factory, which is important to think about. Inland sites develop differently from coastal sites. I said at the beginning of the introduction that this site it's uninterrupted for 4,000 years. To today, it's going on. Okay. Iosizomnos, Alamramutes, Idalion are connected, as we'll see. Similarly, Politico Trulia and Thomasos, the hinterlands on what I call the chert line, what Jennifer Webb refers to as the interface between the igneous and the sedimentary belt. If you look on Google Maps, you see a white line. That's the chert line. Okay. And these sites, Alhambra Mutes and Politico Trulia and a whole bunch of others, are right along that line, and they are the mining and copper producing sites. They begin developing at around 2200 BCE with copper exploitation. This is also notably the beginning of the date, and this is also in publication, of the 42K BP climate disturbances in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's possible that that added to some of the settlement agglomeration. Some settlements are abandoned during that period and others begin to grow. Jennifer Webb has an article in the CAARI volume that Lindy was referring to, talking about the carrying capacity of the land. In that case, she's talking about the site of Marghi, but it applies to any of the sites on the chert line. By 2000 BCE, they're trading abroad. Okay, this is important. By about the 19th century, they're engaged in specialized trade and exchange with coastal sites to expedite overseas trade to the east and the west. We're going to talk about these sites in a minute too, Angami, Salamis, actually, and Kapsida, but we'll get there. Hala Sultan Tekke and Kitian. Now, why do I keep bringing up Iosezomenos? You can see that already in 2013 and here in 2017, you can see enormous, really clearly monumental structures that are emerging in the Lake Cypriot 2C, as she reports it. It's also important to note that the excavators of Alhambra Mutes, that is John Coleman in the 70s and Andrew Snedden in the 20-teens, they agree that their copper working evident in all the places they excavated at Alhambra Mutes was around 2200 BCE. Now, Knapp in 2023, the same book that I referred to before, he talks about 2 pure copper ingots and the 3 molds found by both Coleman and Snedden. And he says that the ingots were produced at this possible, that the ingots were produced at the site, and the molds and the 2 ingots suggest, and this is the point, obviously, some of the copper cast at Alhambra was the result of standardized production and was intended for transport and or trade, whether local or farther afield. Well, how did it get farther afield? Now, starting work on this in sort of 10 years ago, you can see that my associate director, Val Wolfel, who does GIS, produced a least cost path analysis between Idalion, Salamis, and Kitian. Great for the first millennium. But of course, we have to remember that before Salamis, we had Ekam, and before Kitian, we had Hala Sultan Tekke. And the most important thing has come out again in the volume that Lindy referred to, the landscape volume. Benoit de Villiers and Michael Brown produced an article showing the geomorphology of the coast was such that in the Middle Bronze Age, Kalopsida was on the coast. That was the port. So I think it's probable that similar, shall we say, least cost paths obtain. It's interesting to me, this is the Tremethos, and Sally Stewart's been working on this for the last 5-7 years. And you can see that it could easily facilitate movement in this direction. So already in the second millennium, early, they are, okay, this is not, it's not really, let's see. No, I just, it's fine. I can push buttons just as easily. Thanks. So I've talked elsewhere about the overlap. That is, in other words, you have the Ios settlement from 2200 BCE to about 1150 BCE, and settlement and working at Idalion goes back to the 13th century BCE. So at some, for at least a couple, 3 centuries, people at Idalion are working. Now, remember what you saw on the foundation of the Adonis temenos. It's pretty rough and ready. I've suggested elsewhere that, that what's going on is, a friend of mine calls it my olfactory theory of history, which is that if you think about it, the settlement grows and people make the cows and the pigs move. Well, it's the same with big pithos factories, right? If you're expanding your settlements, you don't want to live next to a big stinky fire and kiln process. So they appear to have come to Idalion. Now, this pithos factory, of course, is part of the issue, and it is very much part of this overlap. Now, I happen to think associated with this, some of you may know that the lower city in particular at Idalion is directly under the plow zone. I mean, the plow marks are in all the architecture. Some of the architecture is literally swept away. We do have in one set of trenches, actually, in the eastern edge of the lower city north excavations, enormous, as I say, undateable, because there are plow marks in the top, piles of clay and sand. And we also have 2 wells very close by. Actually, in this area, this whole area, the wells are 5 to 10 meters apart. They're just all over the place. And right near them, there are these 3 huge settling tanks, very shallow, medium, and then this very large one, which became a Bothros in about the 2nd century BCE and was sealed with an altar and a burnt offering. In here, a jar, a plain white jug with its neck broken, typically, full of ash. Normally, we don't have anything but ash in these jars, but this one had the distal end of a caprid radius. For those of you non-specialists, it's a leg of lamb, okay, a burnt offering on the sealed floor. Now, after this period, the continuing periods, well known. I mean, everybody's aware of the 9th century BCE stronghold that the Swedes found on the top of the West Acropolis, which also had actually in this little area a small shrine to the great goddess as warrior. This is, he was right to call it a stronghold, there's no question, because you can't see the site from there. All you can see is all the approaches from the south. Now, why? Well, when did the Phoenicians turn up? At Gideon, 9th century. I suspect that they were starting to try to grab the copper producing areas. When I explain it to my students, I call it the McDonald's theory of copper production. They say, if you own the cows, you don't have to buy the beef. So if you own the mines, you don't have to buy the copper. I suspect it was this. By the 8th century, the city was undeniable. This is, every time I look at this, I get tired. It took me 3 weeks to ink this for Larry Steger in 1975. But that was when we had rapidograph pens and huge light tables, and we did everything. Very, very long process, but it was a brilliant excavation. You can see the founding levels, the foundation trench of the large fortification walls from 500 BCE. And from my point of view, most interesting is the stuff they found underneath. Really large architecture dating to the 8th century BCE. And truly substantial. And of course, when I excavated later in 1987, also in this area, well, further toward the north, but on the West Terrace, we found, I did a sounding against the northern building of the administrative center, and we found an earlier curbstone in the 7th century BCE. We were not done. We didn't get to the bottom. So clearly it was a major center at this point. Not quite what happened just then. But in the lower city, many of you are familiar with this series of strata that I have shown in workshops. Every one of these has a floor associated with it. You can see the walls expanding, actually shrinking as they get later, but each one has a floor associated with it. And there's, no question that they're using this area continually and for the same purposes. The walls continue and the floors continue just as they did in the lower city north. You've already seen the founding of the Adonis temenos. This is going to come back again later. This is what I meant when I said it's kind of rough and ready at the beginning, but it keeps on going. In fact, this square goes right through to the Hellenistic period. So in the lower city north, in the industrial area, it's really, really stark. This deep sounding that we did in the, would you say late 90s? I have to go back and look, I apologize. I think right around 2000. It was very startling. It was floor after floor, earthen floor, each one eaten away by liquid at the end of this work platform. And as we went down, we found that there would be a nice flat floor, and then it was eaten away, and then they would add a row of stones to the top, and another course, and another floor, and up it went from 1300 to the 1st century BCE. It was, if you've ever dug in this area of the Mesoarea, I used to joke with students that the soil runs the gamut from 10YR7/3 to 10YR7/5. You have to be able to see very fine variations. But this is what they did all the way along. And in the top, the Hellenistic level below the plow zone was a drain. And we assume, see, this is just to the west of the deep sounding. We assume that those probably started earlier too. What were they doing? I have my guess, but you can guess just as well as I can. I think they're dyeing stuff because we have lots and lots of little waves. So they're doing something with water anyway. Now, a lot of you have seen this map too, without the Byzantine and Frankish. Because Steger and Walker did excavate these. In fact, this was 1973. I remember it very well. And I was there. So that's how I know. But I couldn't find it in any of their publications. So I just indicated it because you need to know that this is continuous without a break. There's no cessation in any period. This long red line is not really kosher because that was in fact dug under Steger and Walker in 1972 by yours truly. But you can see why I put it in red, just to let you know. So really the continuation at the site of Idalion proper is 1300 BCE to today and ongoing, we assume. If we include Ethal, which I believe is Iosausomenos, mentioned Ethal mentioned by Ramses III, then perhaps they were the patrons of Olambramutes. So we can say 2200 to today without a break. But that's not all. Okay, all this stuff is published, but you know the old saying, what you see is what you get. We all say that when we're digging. It really is true. And this was a plaque found in the lower city in Hellenistic layers, but you can see that it was broken. It actually has a scratched, incised inscription on the back in Cypro-Slavic, by the way. But I started, it's published in the RDAC, 1999. But I started thinking about the volutes. Now, in my defense, I was working full-time and raising 3 children and excavating every summer. So I didn't have a lot of time to write, but I did read a lot. And one of the important things that was getting on my nerves was the fact that everybody called these Hathor capitals, Hathor capitals. But I knew that none of the Hathor, oh gosh, we're doing this again, are we? Yes. Okay, there we go. None of the Hathor statues right down to the first millennium in Egypt have curls. What they do have are these interesting, we can call them upside down volutes if you like, but I can tell you exactly where they come from. Okay, we are going to do this instead. The origin of these not Hathor curls is not Egypt. It is Mesopotamia. And you can see that they get elaborate over time and they begin to have additional, shall we say, volutes in all directions. And you can see on the sarcophagus in New York what really is, in fact, a proto-Aeolic capital repeated over and over. And this is, it took me 10 years, okay, to track it down century by century, image by image. Who was the quintessential queen of heaven? It was Inanna in the 4th millennium BCE. And this is where you begin to see this motif. It continues, as I say, century by century. This article is in the Kyle McCarter Festschrift. I have the bibliography on here. In the 1st millennium BCE, oops, there was more here. Babylon's Ishtar Gate, right? And you can see our familiar proto-Aeolic capitals. But I had already been irritated for a long time by people saying, oh, the Proto-Aeolic capitals came from the Levant in the 10th century, and they were copied by the Greeks. And that's where they started. And I kept saying, but what about the stuff in Cyprus? Lots and lots of stuff in Cyprus that look a whole lot to me like volumes. Okay, so that's what really made me think about this for such a long time. Now, to come to Cyprus from the ancient Near East, there has to be a connection, or at least a close travel back and forth. Well, we know there is. I mean, for heaven's sake, we've got the tripod stands all over the Mediterranean, as far west as Sardinia, for heaven's sake. And of course, all over the Near East. So we know that they're trading back and forth, they're seeing each other's stuff. But after the 10th century BCE, and you got Proto-Aeolic all over the place, that's not a problem. But there are only two places where the original Inanna sheaves keep their original form. One is in Israel, and you can see them here on the Tanakh stand. And the other, and here is a close-up actually of them with actually two cherubim. See, they'll later be called winged sphinxes, but in fact, cherubim is what they're called actually in the Bible, in Ezekiel, and also in Hebrew. It was transliterated by the urgent and conscientious King James translators who didn't know every word, but when they didn't know a word, they transliterated it. And they transliterated cherub, guardian figure, as cherub. But these are the cherubs. They're not fat little babies with wings. Just saying. Little fun fact. Okay. The other place where they exist in their original form is Cyprus. You can see this is the original. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I apologize. Oh gosh, we're going the wrong way. My fault. If these two Hellenistic capitals are from Haji Abdullah, and this limestone plaque you've already seen in Hellenistic layers, although it was created earlier. They are the original form. Now, I think I know why. I think why Israel and Cyprus, it's not that hard to figure out. Both cultures had, in the first millennium, aniconic deities, including a Queen of Heaven, Asherah in Israel, and La Grande Déesse de Chypre, whose name we don't know here. And just in case you're still worrying about the curls, which I was, I traced them again, century by century, and they go right from the 4th millennium on down as the guardians, that is, the servants of Inanna. That's where the curls come from. And they continue. So that's one excursion into a side road. Lower City South, which we now call the City Sanctuary. Some of you probably remember the years in which I was presenting work on the sanctuary of the paired deities before we realized in 2014 that there were 3. Anyway, the great goddess and her acolytes, the mistress and master of animals. And I think I presented this in the 2015 workshop. You can see here the huge ash deposit, enormous ash deposits underneath this floor that goes all the way across this room space. And it has, it's just Pise, and it's 7 to 10 centimeters, completely uniform all the way across. And in that Pise, we found 5th century Attic black glaze pottery. Nothing earlier, nothing later. So I assume that's when it happened. And of course, Kitty unconquered Idalion at about 450 BCE. Now, the charcoal from this enormous conflagration, my husband and I took a huge chunk of it to the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot in Israel, and they identified it as holm oak, a large tree that could, of course, grow to 30 meters tall and be 1.5 meters in diameter, et cetera, et cetera. This was when we realized that there were not just 2 platforms for these Xoana wooden or Asherah poles, if they were in Israel, but there were 3, and the 3rd one was really big. So we have, of course, lots of terracottas showing us people addressing themselves to tree trunks. Now, I've been told that they're dancing. I've been told they're praying. All I know is they're facing it and their arms are out. Okay. Whatever they're doing, that tree is the focus of their attention. And it's not a growing tree, right? It has a vessel on top, a vessel down here. Water is important. That's going to come back to haunt us too. And doves. We don't have time to deal with the doves, but it's interesting that this, of course, all happens in Israel as well. And we have in Kings and Exodus the fact that, oops, sorry, that was, okay, I did something terrible. I'm through, I don't know what I did. Did I fix it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so you can read the biblical comments. Now, this, as you saw, the Xoana were destroyed in 450, so they clearly went on, but they were there for longer before that. But in the 1st century BC, actually, yeah, 1st century BCE, in an area that we'll see later, we found this ash pit with a square socket in the bottom, lined with plaster. And in the plaster, you could clearly see the grains of wood. So they had an Asherah pole of their own in this area, which was a feasting area. Oh, people call it that. They're cooking there. Okay, I'll show it to you in a while. Now, the lower city south is an enormous sanctuary area. We have not found the limits. It is, as you can see, 41 meters so far east to west and 28 meters north to south. Geophys tells us that there are structures to the west, to the north, and to the east. But it looks like spaghetti. I mean, there's just one after another. So we never found the limits, but the stuff we found was really interesting. Here it's a little bit easier to read. You can see the squares and the outlines, at least, of the various structures. The thing that we're here to talk about right now is what I think of as the architectural anomaly here in the eastern squares. You can see that this orientation northwest, southeast is maintained, as you saw in that one slide, all the way from 1150 BCE, the founding of this sanctuary, all the way up to the Roman period. Now, interestingly enough, Val Wolfel, GIS expert who has examined all the maps, put them together, says that every structure before the Roman period on both Acropolis and in all the lower city fields have this orientation. And it certainly is true in the Adonis Temenos on the east terrace of the East Acropolis. But and also in the Hellenistic layers. So this is important. This happened suddenly and apparently enigmatically. It's not really that strange. Cities in the Hellenistic period were arranged according to the Hellenistic Empire. There were two coastal sites, Arsinoe, Salamis, and Lydra was the center point between the two. Well, that means that Idalion, or Idalium as it becomes, was secondary. It was not an important site anymore. It was with some interest I noticed that Magda Unifalschrichter reports gleefully that it's a one-day donkey ride from Larnaca to Dali. Well, I'll bet it was then too. So I posit that it was probably a way station on the way from Kitium to Lydra. What that means is that these squares are looking toward something different. You can see the East End enigma, if you like, in action. In East Omicron 17 and 18, this all became clear in 2017, because what we discovered was, and you can see how wonky this wall is, but in fact we have floors. There's another floor in here. This is actually the 4th century. There's a 2nd century floor that you can't really see, but this is where they, shall we say, adapted the original, to the new setting. And I think it's clearly, because of the Roman road, which, remember this non-kosher line? That's the Roman road I dug up in these two squares, and it is in a straight line here that matches the architecture we're looking at. And Jody Gordon and a lot of other people have noticed this change, and Idalion was no different. They wanted to keep up with the new stuff. They were reorienting public structures to align with roads to be properly Roman, we assume, no doubt to appear more modern. So this one goes on until the 7th century CE. Okay. Just saying. Okay, there are a lot of other extraordinary features about this sanctuary. In the 11th century BCE, there is an altar that's almost identical in every way, construction and dimensions, to the one at Kitian. There are only open lamps all the way from the beginning to into the Hellenistic. In the Adonis Temenos, we have nothing but closed lamps from about the 4th century. And we have lots of inscriptions, and they're all suprasyllabic, all of them. They're now being studied, by Hedvig Enegren in Denmark. So not unique, we have water features, there's even a Roman replacement of the one here. I think there are water features elsewhere, but I always think of Amethyst, the top of Amethyst, but these copules fascinate me. And of course, our son in 2004 demonstrating their use. Anyway, we have other things I have not been able to describe or explain or actually go into. I mean, I know that this is an ancestor circle. I presented it at an AIA conference, and Carla Antonaccio happened to be the chair of that session, and she wrote a book on these. So I'm sure that's what that is. We also have these offering benches. I use that term because that's what they call them in Israel. They're platforms that they look like walls, but there's no mud brick anywhere. They're just the sockles. And they often have bedrock pits cut next to them. And we have cooking installations. This one, very interestingly, had this grindstone on top of that. And you can see these two features, which have standing stones with offering platforms in front of them, analogous to what we saw in the 12th century BCE on the top of the East Acropolis. So the last use in the Adonis Temenos is also something to do with feasting. And there's lots of work still to do. I have to thank a lot of people. References are here if anybody wants them. Special thanks to the Department of Antiquities, CAARI and the staff, and the literally dozens, if not hundreds, of students and volunteers. And especially those of you who are colleagues who've been very patient with me while I was raising my kids and working. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pam, for that journey through and around and into Idalion. And I'm sure people must